The letter was 6 sentences long, and Isabel Rankin had read it 40 times. She sat in the third-class carriage of the Canadian Pacific Railway somewhere west of Winnipeg, with the flat Manitoba prairie scrolling past the window in the long blue light of early evening, and she held the letter on her knee the way she'd been holding it since Halifax. Not to read it again. She had it memorized now, but because the paper itself felt like a decision, and she hadn't entirely made it yet. Miss Rankin, I am in need of a capable woman for my homestead near Dunmore, Alberta Territory. The work is hard and the winters are harder. I am not a man who makes promises he cannot keep, and I am not a man given to conversation. What I can offer is a roof, 3 meals a day, and honest work. If that is enough for you, write back. If it is not, I understand. A. Muir. No warmth, no flourish. Just words pressed into paper the way a man marks a fence post, straight functional without apology. She had written back the same day. She'd had reasons not to. Her father dead 3 months, the house in Halifax half cleared, the creditor's letters stacking up on the kitchen table like a slow tide rising. She had reasons to stay. She had no money to stay with, which was the more honest version of the same fact. And there had been the other thing, the thing that had pushed her past the practical calculation entirely. She had been sitting in her father's examination room, with his medical bag open on the table, and his journals spread around her, and she had understood with the sudden clarity of a diagnosis long in coming, that if she stayed in Halifax, the person she was becoming would slowly stop being. Dr. Rankin had been a country physician for 31 years. His daughter had been at his side for most of them. She knew how to set a bone, suture a wound, recognize the onset of a dozen different fevers. She had kept his records, prepared his medicines, and sat with his patients when he couldn't arrive in time. She had done all of this without credentials, without recognition, and without complaint. Because it was useful, and because she loved him, and because it was the only kind of work that had ever made her feel fully awake. Halifax did not know what to do with her. Neither did most other places she could name. Alberta might be different, or it might not, but it was somewhere to find out. The train crossed into the foothills on a gray Tuesday morning, and the prairie gave way to something larger. Mountains in the distance, impossible and white, the sky so enormous it made her catch her breath against the glass. She had not been prepared for the size of it. She had not been prepared for the feeling it produced. Equal parts terrified, and, underneath the terror, something that she recognized after a moment as relief. A ranch hand named Hugh Carver met her at the Dunmore station with a weathered hat and an expression she couldn't quite read. Not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it, a man revising an expectation in real time. "Miss Rankin," he said. "That's me," she said, and put out her hand. He looked at it for a half-second before he took it. Then he picked up her trunk and led her to the wagon without another word. They rode for nearly 2 hours through country so open and raw it looked like the beginning of the world. Hugh said almost nothing. She used the silence to review what she knew, which was practical and limited. She could cook, she could preserve, she could manage accounts, she could tend animals, she could, though she did not intend to mention this yet, do considerably more than any of that. She had not come all this way to be anyone's housekeeper. But she had learned long ago that what you could do and what you were immediately credited with being able to do were rarely the same list, and that patience was not a concession. It was a strategy. She had not prepared herself for Alec Muir. He was standing at the paddock fence when the wagon came up the track, and he didn't move toward them. He stood with one boot on the lowest rail and his forearms resting on the top, watching her climb down from the wagon with an expression that gave away nothing. He was perhaps 38, lean and broad-shouldered with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that seemed to have been decided on rather than grown. His eyes were the color of the mountains she'd seen from the train, a gray so pale it was almost silver, and completely still. "Mr. Muir," she said, walking toward him with her hand out. "Isabel Rankin." He looked at her hand. He took it briefly. His grip was firm and impersonal. "You're younger than I expected," he said. "I'm 27, she said, which is old enough for most things. Something moved in his expression. A flicker quickly covered. He turned toward the house. "Hugh will show you where things are. Supper's your responsibility starting tonight." He walked back toward the barn without waiting for her answer. Isabel stood in the yard and let out a long, quiet breath. Behind her, she heard Hugh produce a sound that might have been a cough. Don't take it personally, Hugh said quietly. He's like that with everyone. How long has he been like that with everyone? She asked. Hugh was quiet for a moment. Going on 6 years now, he said. She didn't ask what had happened 6 years ago. She didn't need to. Some kinds of silence are their own explanation. The homestead was larger than she'd expected and emptier than she could have imagined. Not empty of furniture, there were tables and chairs and a good cook stove and a parlor with 2 armchairs before a cold fireplace, but empty the way a room is empty after the person who made it a room is gone. The bones were all there. The life had gone out of them. She noticed things as she moved through it, the way she'd been trained to notice things. A woman's shawl on the hook by the back door, dry and faded with years. A pair of small boots beside the woodpile, too small for a child who would ever grow into them now. And in the hallway between the kitchen and the back room, a glass-fronted cabinet with a lock on it, and behind the glass, the unmistakable shape of a black medical bag. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she went to the kitchen and started a fire in the cook stove. She made a pot of beef soup and fresh bread from the provisions she found in the larder, and when it was ready she set the table the way her mother had always insisted, plate centered, cutlery straight, a jug of water in the middle. When Alec Muir came in from outside at 7:15, he stopped for just a moment in the kitchen doorway, and something crossed his face before he sat down without a word. They ate in a silence so complete she could hear the fire in the stove. He ate everything. When he pushed back from the table, he paused. "The soup's good," he said, the way a man states the temperature outside, a fact offered without investment. "Thank you," she said. Another silence. "Early start tomorrow," he said. 6 o'clock. "I'll have breakfast ready by 5:30, she told him. He looked at her for just a moment, the kind of look that was not quite surprise and not quite reassessment, but lived somewhere between them, and then he nodded once and left the kitchen. The first week was an education in distance. Alec Muir moved through his own homestead like a man who had signed a private agreement with himself never to need anything from anyone. He was up before light, in the paddock or the outbuildings, before she had the stove going, and he came inside only for meals and sleep. He moved around her with the particular care of a man who has decided not to see something he isn't ready to see. He left her a list of duties on the second morning: kitchen, garden, accounts, mending. No explanation, just a column of tasks. She read it once, folded it, and put it away. Then she did everything on the list, and then she did more, because the homestead needed more. She found a broken latch on the root cellar, and fixed it herself with tools from the barn. She replanted the kitchen garden, which had gone to seed and weeds, working with her hands in the cold Alberta soil until her back ached and her knuckles were raw. She organized the larder and found a record book for the property's expenses that hadn't been reconciled in at least 2 years. On the 9th day, Alec came in during the afternoon, which he never did, and found her at the desk with the record book open and a column of her own figures added carefully in the margin. "What are you doing?" he said, and his voice had an edge she hadn't heard before. "The accounts," she said, turning to face him. "You've been overcharged by the feed merchant in Calgary 3 times in 18 months. And there's a discrepancy in the winter lumber costs I can't account for." He stared at her. "Those are private records," he said. "You put accounts on the list," she said steadily. "Accounts means accounts, Mr. Muir. I didn't look at anything that wasn't directly relevant to the figures." "You had no right." "I had the list," she said. "If you'd like me to leave the books as they are, I will. But you should know that at the rate you're being overcharged, you'll have trouble meeting your spring costs in about 2 years. Silence. Alex stood in the middle of the kitchen with his hands at his sides and looked at the record book, and then at her, and then at the record book again. "How do you know how to read a ledger like that?" he said at last. The edge was still there, but something else had entered his voice. "My father kept meticulous records," she said. "I kept them for him from the time I was 14. "Your father," he said. "What was his trade?" She held his gaze. "He was a physician," she said, "in Halifax for 31 years. A silence that was different from all the ones before it. "Sit down," she said quietly, and turned back to the desk. "I'll show you what I found." He pulled up a chair and sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the cold still coming off his jacket. And he listened, not politely, not passively, but the way a person listens when the information genuinely matters to them. He asked sharp questions. He pointed to figures she hadn't yet reached and wanted to understand them. By the end of an hour, he had drafted a letter to the Calgary feed merchant himself, sitting at the same desk. When they finished, he sat back and looked at the corrected page for a long moment. "I'll send the letter tomorrow," he said. "Good," she said. He didn't move immediately. "Why did you come all the way out here?" he said, not looking at her. "You could have found work in Halifax." "There wasn't much work left for me in Halifax," she said carefully. "There's not much of anything out here either," he said. "There's this," she said. She meant the accounts. She also meant more than that, and the way he glanced at her suggested he heard both. He stood up and left the kitchen without another word. But that evening at supper he said, unprompted, "The garden's coming in better." "Another week or two," she said. "We'll have carrots." "Good," he said. It wasn't a conversation, but it was the beginning of something. The truth about the locked medical bag came from Hugh, on a cold afternoon when he found Isabel coming back from the far paddock with the first real basket of garden vegetables. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "You can try," she said. "Why are you still here?" He said it gently, with no cruelty in it. "Because I have seen 4 women to this homestead in the past 3 years, and not one of them lasted a month. He's not easy. The winters aren't easy. And," he tilted his head toward the barn, "he's not going to make it easy." "I know," she said. "So why?" She considered the honest answer. "Because leaving is easy," she said, "and I've never been especially good at easy things." Hugh looked at her for a long moment. Then he said carefully, "He was going to be a doctor. Did you know that?" She didn't answer. She waited. "He studied in Calgary. 2 years in at the medical college. His wife took sick while he was away, Margaret and the baby both. Scarlet fever. He rode hard, but he didn't make it in time." Hugh's voice stayed steady and kind. "He never went back after. Locked up the bag and locked up most of himself along with it, far as I can tell." The garden was very quiet. "What was the baby's name?" Isabel asked. Hugh looked at her. "Elspeth," he said. "She was 8 months old." Isabel stood with the basket in her hands and let the weight of that land in her fully, without flinching away from it. "He doesn't need pity," she said at last. "Lord, no," Hugh agreed. "He'd never forgive you for it." "I know," she said. And she did. "In the particular way you know things about people you have been paying very careful attention to." The scarlet fever arrived in Dunmore on a Friday in early autumn. It came in with a family from the east, passing through on their way to British Columbia. By Sunday, the innkeeper's youngest son was sick. By Wednesday, there were 11 cases confirmed, and Dr. Radnor, the town's only physician, was working without sleep. Isabel heard about it from Mrs. Teague, the postmaster's wife, who came by the homestead that Wednesday afternoon. Isabel listened to everything Mrs. Teague could tell her about the cases. Who was sick, how high the fevers were running, which children were worst. That evening, she told Alec. He went very still. "Dr. Radnor is managing 11 patients alone," she said carefully. "The minister's youngest, a boy of 4, is the worst of them." "Radnor's a capable man," Alec said. "He's one person," she said. Alec looked at her. Something in his face had gone flat and controlled in a way she hadn't seen before. "Don't," he said, not angrily, quietly, the quiet of something being held very still by a great deal of effort. She nodded once. She didn't push. She went to town the next morning before he was up. She found the church being used as an overflow infirmary. 4 cots along the far wall, Mrs. Teague and 2 other women doing what they could. Dr. Radnor was there, a man in his 60s with a gray beard and the expression of someone who hadn't slept in 3 days. He looked at her when she walked in and said, not unkindly, "This isn't a place for visitors." "I'm not here to visit," she said. "My father was a physician for 31 years. I assisted him for most of them. Put me to work." He looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching. "The boy on the end cot," he said at last. "His fever's been at 104 for 18 hours. Keep it monitored and come find me if it goes higher." She moved to the boy's cot before Radnor finished the sentence. It was late afternoon when Alec Muir came through the church doors. He stopped when he saw her. She was at the boy's cot. James, she'd learned, the minister's son, sponging his face with cold water and tracking his breathing in the small notebook she'd brought. Alex stood at the back of the church for a moment, then came forward, and he did not say anything to her, and she did not stop what she was doing. James took a turn for the worse at 7 o'clock. His breathing changed, labored, rapid, the particular sound she had heard twice in her father's sick rooms, and learned to recognize with a cold efficiency that left no room for panic. Dr. Radnor was across town with a family where 2 more children had just presented with symptoms. Mrs. Teague went to find him. The other women looked at Isabel. She knew what needed to be done. She had read it in her father's journals and watched him do it once when she was 19. For a child in similar straits, she knew the risk. She knew the alternative. She did it. By the time Dr. Radnor arrived, James's breathing had steadied. Radnor examined the boy, looked at what she'd done, and looked at her with an expression she could not fully read. "Where did you learn that?" he said. "My father," she said. Dr. Owen Rankin, Halifax. He wrote it up for the Canadian Medical Association in 1887. Radnor was quiet for a moment. "I read that paper," he said. "I helped him write it," she said. Alec Muir was standing 10 feet away. She had not looked directly at him once. He was waiting at the homestead when she returned, well after dark. Hugh had made tea and left it on the stove and removed himself with considerable tact to the bunkhouse. Alec was at the kitchen table. He had the locked medical bag open in front of him. He was not looking at it. He was looking at the door when she came through it. She stopped. "Sit down, Isabel," he said. It was the first time he'd used her given name. They both registered it. She sat across from him. Her hands, she noticed, were trembling slightly, the aftermath of controlled effort, the body remembering what the mind had held still throughout the day. She put them flat on the table and left them there. He reached across and without a word wrapped them both in his, the way you might still something fragile, practical and precise. His hands were warm and calloused and very steady. "You knew what to do for him," he said. "Yes," she said. "You've done it before." "No," she said honestly, "but I'd seen it done and I'd read everything my father wrote about it." There wasn't time to wait for Radnor. He looked at their hands for a moment. "She had a fever," he said. "Elspeth. It came on fast the way it does with very young children. Margaret had it too, but she was stronger and I thought," he stopped. "I thought I had more time. I was 2 days' ride away and I thought I had more time." His voice was very steady, and she understood that steadiness was what it cost him to say it at all. "By the time I got back, Elspeth was gone. Margaret lasted 3 more days." Isabel said nothing. She let him have the fullness of it. "You can't learn everything in a book," he said at last. "My instructors told me that. I thought 2 more years and then I'd know enough to." He stopped again. "It doesn't matter what I thought." "It does matter," she said quietly. "What you thought was right. 2 more years and you would have known enough for most things. It was 6 years ago and you were doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing, and it happened anyway. That's not a failure, it's a fact, and facts are not the same as faults." He looked at her. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" "Say the true thing without making it smaller than it is." "My father taught me," she said. "He said the most unkind thing you can do for a person in grief is try to make it tidier than it really is." Alec was quiet for a long moment. His hands were still around hers. She thought he had forgotten they were there, and she didn't move. "Elspeth would have been 7 years old this past March," he said. Then, after a pause that held 6 years in it, "She looked like her mother, completely. Not a thing of mine in her face." "That sounds like someone worth missing," Isabel said carefully. "I don't know how to stop," he said. "You don't have to stop," she said. "Missing someone doesn't work that way. It just changes, eventually. It becomes something you carry rather than something that carries you." He released her hands. He sat back. "Has it for you?" She thought of her father, 3 months gone, and the specific shape of the absence he'd left. Not smaller, but more familiar, the way a scar becomes part of the landscape of a hand. "It changes," she said. "That's the best I can tell you." He nodded once. He closed the medical bag and looked at it for a moment, then stood and said good night, and left the kitchen. Isabel sat alone for a long while after, listening to the wind off the foothills, pressing against the windows. Something had shifted. Not love, not yet, not anything that simple yet, but a giving of ground on both sides, and in a person as carefully defended as Alec Muir, even a small ground given was something to pay attention to. 3 weeks later, Dr. Radner stood up at the town meeting and said, in front of 47 people and the territorial registrar who happened to be passing through, that Isabel Rankin's intervention had saved James Colburn's life and that in his professional judgment, any homestead in this territory was fortunate to have access to her skills. She kept her face entirely composed throughout. What she had not prepared for was the letter that arrived the following week from Halifax. It was 3 pages of precise legal language from the solicitor managing her father's estate, and it added up to one simple and devastating fact. Her father's creditors had called in the full debt, and if the estate could not satisfy it by the 1st of January, Isabel would have no claim to anything remaining, not the house, not the instruments, not the library of medical texts she had grown up inside. It was not a large debt. It was, however, considerably larger than anything she had. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it, put it in her apron pocket, and went back to the kitchen garden, because the late Carrots did not care about her problems, and neither would they wait. She began to pack, quietly, at night, telling herself she was only sorting. She had been telling herself this for 4 days, when Hugh appeared at the kitchen door on a Tuesday evening, with his hat in his hands, and a look she hadn't seen from him before. "He wants to talk to you," Hugh said, "out at the paddock." She set down the jar she was wrapping and went. Alec was at the paddock fence, not leaning on it the way he usually did, but standing straight, turned toward her as she came up the track, as if he'd been watching for her. The mountains were going pink in the last of the afternoon light, and the air smelled of wood smoke and cold. "You're leaving," he said, not a question. "I may need to go back to Halifax," she said carefully. "There's a matter with my father's estate." "Hugh told me about the letter," Alex said. She glanced toward the barn, where Hugh had positioned himself at a diplomatically useful distance. "It's not your concern," she said. "No," Alex said, "it isn't." He was quiet for a moment, "but I'm making it mine." She looked at him. "I have savings," he said. "The homestead has done well enough these past years, partly because of the ledger work you did, partly because you wrote that letter to the Calgary merchant, partly because you fixed the root cellar latch I had been meaning to get to since April." He said that last part with a dryness she'd come to recognize as his particular version of humor, rare and genuine and worth watching for. "I can settle the Halifax debt." "I'm not going to let you do that," she said. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "I'm offering—" He stopped. He started again more carefully, in the way he always did when what he was saying cost him something real. "I placed that advertisement because Hugh told me the house was killing me. I thought I needed a capable woman. Someone practical." He met her eyes directly. "I didn't know I needed you specifically." The paddock was very quiet. "That," she said, "is possibly the least romantic thing I have ever heard anyone say." Something shifted in his expression, the near smile she'd spent weeks learning to read. "I'm not finished," he said. She waited. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because the accounts need doing or the garden needs tending or because the town has decided you saved a child's life, though all of those things are true. I want you to stay because—" the pause of a man making certain he says the honest thing correctly, "because this homestead has been the wrong kind of quiet for 6 years. And since you arrived it hasn't been. And I hadn't understood until recently how much that mattered." She looked at him for a long moment. "Ask me properly," she said. He understood what she meant. "Stay," he said, "properly, not for the homestead." "Yes," she said. He exhaled, long and slow and deep, the exhale of a man setting down something he hadn't known he was carrying. Before they went back inside, she said, "The medical bag." He looked at her. "It's been locked for 6 years," she said. "I think it's time you opened it." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I can go back to it," he said. "You were already going back to it," she said. "The night Hugh was hurt, you didn't even think. You just went for it. You just need someone beside you when you do." He looked at the mountains. "I have my father's journals," she said. "All of them. They're in my trunk. I'd packed everything else to leave behind, but I packed those first." She paused. "I know what they're worth. I know what this town needs. And I know what you were 2 years away from being before any of this happened." The last of the light was leaving the mountains. "It wouldn't be me practicing," he said carefully. "I'd need to finish the certification, correspondence study, Radnor's endorsement." which I believe you could get, she said. And in the meantime, a clinic. He was quiet for a moment. With your name on it too, he said. If you're doing this alongside me, Isabel, your name is on the door. She felt something open in her chest, simple and enormous and very long in coming. The feeling of being seen clearly by someone who knew exactly what they were looking at and was not the slightest bit sorry for it. All right, she said, our names. They were married in the spring, when the foothills had gone green and the last of the snow was off the high peaks. The ceremony was small by intention, not limitation. Hugh, Mrs. Teague, Dr. Radnor, and a minister who had his own reasons for thinking well of them both. Hugh wept openly and apologized to no one. A year after that, the clinic opened on Dunmore's Main Street. The door had 2 names on it. The glass-fronted cabinet that had stood locked in the hallway of the homestead for 6 years stood open now in the clinic's back room, the black medical bag sitting on the top shelf, ready. The small boots remained on the shelf at the homestead. Isabel had never moved them and had never suggested they should be moved. But the shelf had been cleaned and the boots polished, and beside them now there sat a small framed photograph. Margaret Muir in a garden somewhere, squinting into the light, smiling, with an infant in her arms, that Alec had kept in a drawer for 6 years, and one morning simply brought into the light without saying anything about it. Isabel hadn't said anything about it either. Some things did not need to be said. Some things only needed to be done, and the doing was the whole of the message. On the evening the clinic saw its 50th patient, they walked home together through the first real snow of the season, their breath white in the cold air, the mountains lost in cloud. Alec stopped at the gate and looked up at the homestead, the warm orange light coming through the kitchen windows. "Are you happy?" Isabel asked. He considered it the way he considered everything she asked him, fully, without evasion, giving the question the weight it deserved. "Yes," he said, simply without condition or qualification. She took his arm and they went inside, into the light and the warmth and the ordinary, irreplaceable life they had built out of 2 people's separate silences and one shared decision to stop being quiet in the wrong way. Outside, the Alberta snow came down the way it always had and always would, indifferent and enormous and beautiful, covering everything equally, the grief and the joy, and the stubborn, necessary love of people who had chosen each other in the middle of everything that made choosing difficult, and had chosen each other still.